A 1906 portrait shows a mother and her son, and experts are puzzled by the woman's expression. In the spring of 2023, Dr. Elizabeth Barnes received a surprising package at her office in the American Studies Department at Columbia University. The sender was an elderly woman from Rochester, New York, who had inherited a group of family photographs. She wanted to know if they had any historical value before donating them to a local museum. Among many ordinary early 20th century family photos, one image immediately drew Dr. Barnes's attention. The formal studio portrait was dated April 12, 1906. It showed a well-dressed woman in her 30s sitting beside a boy who looked about 8 years old. The photographer's embossed stamp showed it was taken at Morrison's photography studio in Rochester, an establishment known for serving wealthy families in the city. At first look, the portrait seemed typical for that time. The woman wore a dark, high-neck dress decorated with detailed beadwork. Her hair was styled in the popular Gibson girl fashion of the Progressive era. The boy, likely her son, stood next to her chair wearing a sailor outfit with short pants and knee-high stockings, his hand placed formally on her shoulder. The studio setting was also standard for 1906. There was an ornate chair, a decorative background, and carefully arranged lighting meant to highlight respectability and social standing. Everything in the image suggested this was a special portrait of a successful mother and her well-cared-for child. Still, something about the woman's expression deeply unsettled Dr. Barnes. In her 15 years studying historical photographs, she had reviewed thousands of portraits from this period and understood the usual expressions people showed. Calm seriousness, faint smiles, or dignified stillness were common, especially since long exposure times required people to hold steady poses. This woman's expression did not fit any of those categories. Her eyes carried an intensity that seemed to pierce through the sepia tones, showing a mix of determination, fear, and what looked like barely controlled panic. What was most disturbing was the clear difference between her facial expression and her posture. Her body followed the formal rules of studio portraiture, but her face told a very different story. The boy beside her looked normal and even cheerful, with no sign that he noticed his mother's inner struggle. As Dr. Barnes studied the photograph more closely, she noticed technical details that made the mystery even deeper. The image quality was remarkably good for 1906, suggesting that Morrison's studio used advanced equipment and modern techniques for that time. However, closer inspection revealed several strange details. The woman's hands, folded in her lap, showed signs of strain that did not match the calm pose. Her knuckles appeared pale even in the sepia image, and slight wrinkles in the fabric of her dress suggested her hands were tightly clenched. Even more confusing was the timing suggested by the photograph. Studio portraits in that era usually required subjects to stay still for several seconds. Yet the woman's expression looked like someone under extreme emotional pressure, not someone calm enough to sit patiently through a long exposure. Dr. Barnes spoke with colleagues who specialized in historical photography. Professor Michael Chen from the Rochester Institute of Technology's photography program reviewed the technical details of the image. He confirmed that the exposure was done correctly, even though the subject appeared to be under emotional strain. The lighting is professional, the focus is clear, and the composition follows the studio standards of the time, Professor Chen explained. But there's something in her expression that suggests she was struggling to keep herself together during the session. Notice the slight blur around her eyes. That often happens when someone is holding back tears or experiencing small, uncontrolled facial movements. Dr. Barnes also consulted Dr. Sarah Whitfield, a psychologist who analyzed historical materials for signs of mental health issues. Dr. Whitfield found the expression equally troubling. She said the woman showed clear signs of extreme stress or fear. Her eyes were wide, showing heightened alertness, and the tight muscles around her mouth suggested she was deliberately controlling her expression. What stood out most was her ability to keep a formal pose while clearly in emotional pain. This pointed either to exceptional self-discipline or to a strong reason that forced her to complete the portrait despite her distress. The sharp contrast between the woman's visible anxiety and the boy's calm appearance added another mystery. Children at that time were usually sensitive to their parents' emotions, yet this boy showed no sign of worry or awareness of his mother's state. Determined to uncover the story behind the portrait, Dr. Barnes began researching the identities of the mother and son. The back of the photograph listed only the studio's stamp and the date, with no names or personal details. Still, their fine clothing and the expensive studio setting suggested they belonged to Rochester's upper class. Morrison's photography studio had been one of the city's most respected studios, serving wealthy families, business owners, and prominent citizens from 1895 to 1920. Dr. Barnes reached out to the Rochester Historical Society, hoping their archives might include records from the studio. The society held some business documents from Morrison's studio, though many had been lost over time. The remaining materials offered interesting hints about the studio's clients and how it operated. Surviving appointment books showed that the studio charged high fees and required advance reservations, especially for formal family portraits. Most notably, the appointment book for April 12, 1906, listed only one session that day. It read, Mrs. H. Caldwell and Son, 2 p.m., special circumstances, payment in advance. The note about special circumstances stood out, since most entries listed only names, times, and standard prices. Further research into Rochester's leading families confirmed that the Caldwells were part of the city's social elite. Henry Caldwell owned a successful agricultural equipment manufacturing business, and the family lived in one of Rochester's most fashionable neighborhoods. Society columns in local newspapers showed that Mrs. Helena Caldwell was active in charitable work and regularly attended social events in the early 1900s. However, Dr. Barnes noticed a clear gap in reports about her during early 1906. While she appeared often in 1905 and later in 1906, there were almost no mentions of her in the first few months of that year, the same period as the unusual portrait session. Census records from 1900 and 1910 confirmed that Helena Caldwell had a son named William, whose age matched the boy in the photograph. But the 1910 census revealed a surprising detail. William Caldwell was listed as living with his grandparents instead of his parents, with no explanation given for this arrangement. These clues suggested that the Caldwell family may have gone through a serious crisis in early 1906, one strong enough to disrupt family life and possibly explain Helena Caldwell's troubled expression during what should have been a normal portrait session. Dr. Barnes's investigation faced another challenge when she tried to access official records from that year. Although most early 20th century public records were well preserved in Rochester's archives, documents related specifically to the Caldwell family showed suspicious gaps during that critical time. Legal records that should have included property dealings, business matters, and family issues were missing or heavily censored. Most striking were several sealed court files from early 1906 that carried the Caldwell name, marked as restricted even more than a century later. Dr. Barnes consulted legal historians familiar with record-keeping practices of that era. Professor James Mitchell from the University of Rochester Law School explained that permanently sealed family court records were extremely uncommon and usually involved serious crimes or issues of national importance. The fact that these files were still sealed after 117 years suggested that something highly unusual had occurred. He noted that normal privacy protections for family cases would have ended many decades ago. This continued level of restriction suggested either ongoing legal consequences or interference by people with strong influence over how records were handled. Hospital records from Rochester's main medical centers also showed strange gaps in early 1906. While Helena Caldwell's name appeared in medical files before and after this time, there was a complete lack of records during the first 3 months of 1906, which was unusual for a wealthy woman who normally had easy access to medical care. Even more interesting, Dr. Barnes found that several well-known Rochester families had temporary left the city in early 1906. Society pages mentioned long European trips and educational travel during this period. The timing of these departures closely matched Helena Caldwell's portrait session and her sudden absence from public life. Available bank records showed unusual activity in the Caldwell family's large accounts during this same period. Significant withdrawals and transfers pointed to either major business actions or preparation for large expenses, possibly including long-term travel or legal costs. The pattern of missing and restricted records, along with evidence of wealthy families leaving Rochester at the same time, suggested that something serious had happened within the city's upper social circles. Helena Caldwell's fearful expression during her portrait session seemed connected to the same events that caused this quiet departure, an apparent effort to hide the truth. The investigation was no longer just about one family. It pointed to a larger scandal that had been carefully hidden by Rochester's most powerful citizens. Dr. Barnes next focused on Rochester newspapers from early 1906, hoping that reports from that time might offer clues about what had affected the city's elite. Her careful review of the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle archives revealed an unusual reporting pattern during the first months of that year. Normally, the paper closely followed social events, business news, and local matters. But in early 1906, there was a noticeable shift toward national and international news. Local coverage focused heavily on events like the San Francisco earthquake and political news from Washington, while Rochester's normally active social scene received little attention. A closer look suggested these were not random editorial choices but intentional omissions. Society pages that usually reported on charity events, gatherings, and family news contained far fewer local stories from January through April 1906. Several journalists who regularly covered Rochester's wealthy families appeared to have taken long breaks during this time. More revealing were small, vague notices hidden in the back pages. Dr. Barnes found short items about extended business trips, families relocating temporarily for health reasons, and social events being postponed due to unexpected issues. Each notice seemed harmless on its own, but together they suggested a planned withdrawal of Rochester's upper class. The most striking find was an editorial published on April 15, 1906, just 3 days after Helena Caldwell's portrait session. The editorial, titled Maintaining Community Standards, spoke about the importance of protecting family privacy and respecting the discretion of valued citizens during personal difficulties. Although it did not name anyone or describe specific events, the timing and wording strongly suggested it referred to a recent situation involving Rochester's social elite. The editorial stressed that responsible journalism must consider the wider impact on the community when covering sensitive family matters, and praised those who chose privacy during difficult times. Dr. Barnes also discovered that the newspaper's editor at the time, Robert Morrison, was the brother of the photographer who had taken Helena Caldwell's portrait. This connection between the newspaper and the photography studio suggested possible coordinati in controlling information. Further research into Robert Morrison's personal papers, stored at the Rochester Historical Society, revealed letters exchanged with leading business figures in early 1906. These letters discussed the need for discretion and protecting community interests during what Morrison called recent unpleasantness. All of this evidence pointed to a coordinated effort by Rochester's leaders to hide information about events that had caused fear, secrecy, and the temporary removal of several wealthy families from the city. Dr. Barnes made a major breakthrough when she gained access to private medical records belonging to Dr. Edmund Thornfield, a physician who treated many of Rochester's prominent families in the early 1900s. Dr. Thornfield's detailed patient notes, preserved by his family and recently donated to the University of Rochester Medical Center archives, provided an uncensored view of medical emergencies affecting the city's elite in early 1906. His notes from January through April of that year showed a troubling pattern unlike his usual work. Instead of routine checkups and minor illnesses, his records described many cases of nervous exhaustion, severe anxiety, and hysteria caused by extraordinary events. Most important was an entry dated April 10, 1906, just 2 days before Helena Caldwell's portrait session, which focused on Mrs. Caldwell herself. Mrs. H. Caldwell presented with intense nervous distress. Patient reports recurring nightmares, lack of sleep, and overwhelming fear. Physical examination shows no clear medical cause. Symptoms appear linked to a recent traumatic experience. Prescribed laudanum for sleep and advised immediate removal from current surroundings. Other entries showed that Dr. Thornfield treated several other prominent women during the same time for similar symptoms. Mrs. Edward Harrison, Mrs. Charles Bennett, and Mrs. William Peaton all sought help for nervous conditions that the doctor linked to witnessing disturbing events. As the crisis continued, Dr. Thornfield's notes became more detailed. His entry for April 12, 1906, the exact date of Helena Caldwell's portrait, added important context. Mrs. Caldwell insisted on attending a previously scheduled photography appointment, despite my strong advice against public appearances in her present condition. Patient stated she felt obligated to maintain normal appearances and protect her son from the situation. Expressed concern about patient's judgment and emotional stability. Later notes showed that Helena Caldwell's condition worsened after the portrait session. Patient returned in complete emotional collapse following photography appointment. Reports inability to control facial expression during session, and fears photographs will expose her distress. Recommended immediate travel to distant relatives and full removal from Rochester. Dr. Thornfield's records also included notes about young William Caldwell, explaining why the boy appeared calm in the portrait. Despite his mother's distress, William was treated only for recurring stomach problems. Patient appears unaware of family crisis due to mother's extreme efforts to shield child from situation. Recommended maintaining child's routine to preserve sense of normalcy. These medical records revealed a community of women deeply traumatized by something they had seen or experienced. Helena Caldwell appeared to be among the most affected. Her decision to go through with the portrait session, against medical advice, explained the striking contrast between her proper posture and her expression of controlled terror. Dr. Barnes's research took a clear turn when she uncovered a link between the medical records and a nearly forgotten industrial accident in Rochester in early 1906. While reviewing Dr. Thornfield's other patients, she noticed that many of the affected women were married to men involved in Rochester's industrial businesses. A search of industrial safety records showed that Caldwell Agricultural Equipment, owned by Henry Caldwell, had been involved in a serious workplace accident on March 15, 1906. The official report sent to the New York State Department of Labor described a mechanical failure that caused worker injuries at the company's main factory. However, the formal language of the report hid the true horror of the event. Dr. Barnes found much more detailed accounts in labor union records and workers' compensation files, which told a far darker story. According to witness statements, the accident involved a catastrophic failure of the factory's main stamping press, used to produce agricultural equipment parts. The massive machine malfunctioned during a shift change, when the largest number of workers were present. Union records included graphic testimony from workers who saw the accident unfold. The press came down while men were still working underneath, one witness reported. The screaming lasted for what felt like hours. There was blood everywhere. Some men were crushed completely, others trapped and calling for help we could not give. Labor union documents showed that the death toll was much higher than what official records claimed. While state reports listed 3 deaths, union records suggested that as many as 12 workers died, with many more badly injured. This difference appeared to result from deliberate underreporting meant to reduce legal responsibility and public attention. Most importantly, Dr. Barnes discovered that several prominent Rochester families, including the Caldwells, had been present at the factory on the day of the accident. Internal company documents showed that Henry Caldwell had arranged a tour of the facility for potential investors and their families, timed to include a demonstration of new machinery. Helena Caldwell, along with other investors' wives, was inside the factory when the stamping press failed. They witnessed the injuries and deaths firsthand, experiencing trauma that wealth and status could not protect them from. The portrait session on April 12, 1906, took place exactly 4 weeks after Helena Caldwell had watched multiple men die in a horrific industrial accident, one that her husband's company then tried to hide through official reports and quiet influence. The industrial accident at Caldwell Agricultural Equipment had set off a large cover-up involving some of the most powerful families and institutions in Rochester. As Dr. Barnes continued her research, she uncovered just how far the city's leaders had gone to hide both the true scale of the accident and the fact that prominent citizens had witnessed it. Company records from Caldwell Agricultural Equipment, accessed through the University of Rochester's Business History Archives, showed that Henry Caldwell had quickly hired one of Rochester's most costly law firms after the accident. Letters between attorneys revealed that the legal plan focused on reducing official death counts and keeping witness statements out of public records. Even more troubling were financial documents showing large payments made by Caldwell's company to the families of the dead workers. These payments were described as generous compensation for workplace injuries, but the attached legal papers required families to sign strict non-disclosure agreements that forbade them from speaking about the accident. Payments were not limited to workers' families. Dr. Barnes found evidence that money also went to city officials, newspaper editors, and even medical staff who responded to the emergency. She discovered that the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle received major advertising contracts from Caldwell's company soon after the accident, which matched the newspaper's reduced local reporting in early 1906. Hospital records that had once been restricted later became available through medical history research requests and revealed the real scale of the emergency. Rochester General Hospital treated far more patients on March 15, 1906 than official reports admitted. Emergency logs listed dozens of workers with severe injuries, many of whom later died from their wounds in the days and weeks that followed. Most importantly, hospital records showed that several well-known women were treated for nervous shock on the day of the accident. Helena Caldwell, along with Mrs. Harrison, Mrs. Bennett, and Mrs. Petton, were brought to the hospital immediately after witnessing the industrial disaster. Medical notes from that day gave painful detail about what these women had seen. Dr. Thornfield's emergency report stated that Mrs. Caldwell and the other women showed extreme signs of traumatic shock. They reported seeing multiple deaths in vivid detail. Mrs. Caldwell specifically said she could not erase the image of trapped workers from her mind and felt responsible for their deaths because of her family's connection to the factory. The cover-up was thorough and organized, relying on legal pressure, financial influence, and cooperation among Rochester's most powerful institutions. Helena Caldwell's expression in the portrait reflected not only her personal trauma but also her awareness that her family was helping hide the truth about the workers' deaths from their families and the public. This systematic effort to conceal the accident explained why several prominent Rochester families left the city in early 1906, but Dr. Barnes found that fear, not just guilt or legal worry, drove their departure. These families were afraid that their presence at the accident would become public, ruining their social status and possibly exposing them to criminal charges. Travel documents and passport records from spring 1906 showed a planned departure of Rochester's elite to Europe. The Caldwells, Harrisons, Bennetts, and Petons all arranged long stays in England, France, and Switzerland. These trips were described as health or educational travel, but clearly served to remove them from possible legal action. Helena Caldwell's portrait session on April 12, 1906, was scheduled as one of her last commitments before the family left for London. Letters preserved in family collections showed that Henry Caldwell insisted the family keep all social appointments until departure, believing that sudden changes might raise suspicion. Dr. Barnes found proof that Helena Caldwell strongly objected to the portrait. In a letter to her sister, she wrote that she could not appear normal for a photograph and feared that her distress would be captured forever. Her husband dismissed her concerns, seeing the portrait as necessary to protect the family's public image before their long absence. The letter to her sister, dated April 11, 1906, revealed Helena's fragile mental state. She wrote that she could not sleep without seeing the workers' faces, hearing the machines fail, and remembering the screams and blood. She expressed fear that her face would reveal what she had seen and questioned how she could pose for a photograph, while the workers' wives were still unaware of the truth about their husbands' deaths. The family remained in Europe for nearly 2 years. By the time they returned to Rochester in late 1907, public attention around the accident had faded. The official story describing a minor accident with few deaths had become accepted as fact. However, the trauma never left Helena Caldwell. Medical records from Dr. Thornfield showed that she continued to receive treatment for anxiety and depression for many years after returning. She never fully resumed her social life and became more withdrawn as she grew older. Most tragically, the portrait meant to show a normal family before their departure instead captured the moment when Helena Caldwell's emotional defenses collapsed under the weight of a terrible secret. Her expression showed not only personal suffering but also the mortal pain of taking part in a lie that denied justice to the dead workers' families. Dr. Barnes's research revealed a story far larger than a single photograph. Helena Caldwell's haunted expression preserved evidence of how industrial disasters were hidden in early 20th century America, often with the help of wealthy families who had seen the events firsthand. The photograph kept what the cover-up tried to erase. It stood as honest proof of the trauma experienced by those who witnessed the deaths of 12 workers at Caldwell Agricultural Equipment. Helena Caldwell's inability to control her expression turned the image into an accidental historical record that challenged decades of official denial and corporate silence. Dr. Barnes published her findings in the Journal of Industrial History, which renewed interest in workplace safety violations from the early 1900s. Her article, Bearing Witness, Photographic Evidence of Trauma in Industrial Cover-Ups, 1906, detailed how powerful families used their influence to hide evidence of worker deaths. The Rochester Historical Society later created a memorial exhibit honoring the workers who died in the March 15, 1906 accident. For the first time in over a century, their names were publicly recognized, and their descendants learned the truth about how their relatives had died. Labor historians used Dr. Barnes's research to review other industrial accidents from the same era, uncovering similar cover-ups across New York State's manufacturing industry. The underreporting of workplace deaths was far more widespread than previously believed. Most importantly, Helena Caldwell's portrait came to be recognized as one of the earliest photographic examples of what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mental health historians noted that her expression captured the deep psychological impact of witnessing industrial violence in a time before such conditions were medically understood. The Morrison Photography Studio's note about special circumstances for Helena Caldwell's session gained new meaning, suggesting the photographer knew he was capturing someone in serious emotional distress. The portrait became evidence of Helena's suffering and a symbol of the human cost of industrial accidents hidden by powerful interests. In the end, what Henry Caldwell intended as a final show of normal life before leaving Rochester instead preserved the proof needed to honor the workers whose deaths were deliberately concealed. Helena Caldwell's expression, frozen in sepia for more than a century, finally spoke for those who were no longer able to speak for themselves.